Good morning, and thank you for joining us for another episode of People Are Our Economy, the bi-weekly online event by Community Change Action and our partners, aiming to make meaning of the headlines and statistics that dominate our news feeds and weigh on our mental load every day. As the national death toll from COVID-19 has reached more than 100,000 people, and as Minneapolis is in turmoil from civil unrest in response to the police killing of George Floyd, we learned that yet another 2.1 million Americans filed new unemployment claims last week. This brings us to a total of about 41 million people who have filed unemployment claims over the last 8 weeks. Now, staggering and unprecedented are starting to feel repetitive as descriptors. The continued reality is that we need action from all levels of government to prioritize people over commodities. The rent is still due, despite our unemployment rate projected to reach 20% by June. Now, while most of us are under stay-at-home measures, the reality is that for too many Americans, they still have no access to a safe, stable home or are one job away from homelessness. And it's not news that people of color are disproportionately impacted in this broken housing system. Now, COVID-19 has reminded us that one of the most basic needs has been out of reach for far too many people. Here we are at the end of the month, and with about 41 million people out of work, the question is, what is being done to help everyone make ends meet in this crisis and afterwards? Rent will be due on June 1st, but we know millions of people won't be able to make a payment because of our public health and economic crises. So for today's discussion, I'm asking that together we remember how housing, which is the foundation of our well-being and mental health, is not a new problem in the United States. But we aren't stuck. Perhaps this moment, driven by the power building that we do in our organizing across the country, perhaps in this moment it will result in enough pressure for lasting systemic change. As we have discussed on past shows, grassroots leaders in the Community Change Action family are designing connectivity across our country, pushing decision makers to commit to systemic change. And this framework of deep structural change, is the appropriate response to advance racial and economic justice and to ensure resources reach the most vulnerable people sooner, instead of repeating past failures from policymakers. Now, on today's show, we welcome two women who are applying pressure to shape the political will at the local, state, and federal levels in order to dismantle the barriers to housing. Their leadership is designing solutions for housing justice across our country. And these women are building power in bold and nimble ways in our Black, Brown, and immigrant communities. So please help me welcome Andreanecia M, Executive Director of Housing New Orleans, and Amina Kirk, Senior Legal and Policy Analyst of Detroit People's Platform. Thank you both for joining this morning, and thanks to the audience for joining us on Facebook and YouTube today. Before we get into the barriers and solutions around housing justice, can you both start us off by sharing what brought you to this work? And Andreanecia, I want to start with you.
Good morning, Dorian. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. And thank you for all of the support that Community Change has provided to our work over the last few years. You guys have been tremendous partners, and we appreciate it. So to answer your question, what brought me to the work was basically dumb luck. My generation is, I'm a Gen Xer, and we had to, as soon as we got out of college, we had to get jobs. And so that meant me going to work, finding a job at our local housing authority, not really having any background in affordable housing. There weren't real options back then. They didn't have community development programs or masters of real estate. Even planning was, not quite on the academic sphere. So that's how I got into affordable housing, which led me to being a developer and now an advocate. So having spent time in all of the spheres, realizing that I think this is the way to solve this problem.
And Amina, I know you grew up in the South, but you're now in Detroit. So talk to us about how you got into this work around housing justice.
Thank you. And I also want to give a shout out and thank Community Change for all of the work that they've done assisting us in Detroit with all of our housing initiatives. So thank you for your support. I am originally from Georgia, and I grew up low income background, and knowing how important housing was just as a staple and a foundation of my life was always present. There was never a time where I was not aware that housing was important and that housing situations and stability were tenuous. It wasn't a permanent fixture and it wasn't a certainty. And that sort of weight that you have knowledge of even as a child, it sticks with you. And growing up low income, that extended into my adulthood as a college student, as a graduate student, that housing instability, displacement was a normal feature, whether it be rising rents or buildings being acquired. It was just always something that I was fully aware of. I was fully aware that there was inequity. And right after college, similar to Andreanica's story, went to work for the local housing authority with that idea in my mind that I wanted to be a social justice advocate, and this was an opportunity. There were a lot of issues and problems that I saw. I came into the housing authority right during the time that moving to work and housing choice vouchers were really taking off all over the country. I was in Atlanta and it was seen as a model for the entire country. And I saw struggles to attempt to apply a lens of equity, but not quite getting there, and decided that was something that I thought could actually be fixed. Being in the social justice realm as a college student, there was so many heavy problems that are going to take generations. And I saw housing as something that there were present solutions and there were ways to implement change that were right in front of our faces. And I wanted to be a part of that. So then I went on to get my law degree and combined that with a Master of Urban Planning degree with a focus on housing and community economic development, wanting to focus on building housing and a foundation for families like mine so that they can be successful and have access to opportunities.
I love the fact that both of you have sort of dual expertise. You have the expertise of lived experience, but then you also have the expertise of actually studying this issue in a deep way. So I just want to really appreciate you both. And it's important, reminding each other of what brings us to this work day after day. It helps with centering us and why we stick with it, So right now, it seems to me our task has an extra layer of difficulty. Our folks are getting sick and dying, and we have to stay in the fight. We have to develop new strategies for engagement, and we have to, of course, take care of each other in terms of this moment we find ourselves in building power. So I want to talk about your experience in the long game of housing justice way before COVID-19, because both of you are not designing solutions to go back to normal. You're building forward for a reality that directs access and resources to our communities and putting pressure on politicians, right, for a new housing reality. So Amina, can you start first here? Talk to us about the continued focus you have on community organizing and what that has meant to the broader housing justice power building efforts.
So my organization has been working on housing for a long time. So I focus on housing and economic development in my role. And Detroit has been facing a housing crisis for going on a decade. We have a lot of housing, but it's in terrible shape. Old housing stock that is not habitable because of a variety of maintenance issues. It's not accessible for our very large disabled community. And the things that are in good shape are not affordable. And that's something that we have known through our community organizing efforts and our on the ground conversations that we continually have with residents every day. At all times, regardless of what policy campaigns we're undertaking. So we've been working on building some sort of housing equity for a very long time. And we've been doing that through policy, but also community organizing, because we think that they are both necessary components of any successful legislation that not only solves the problem, but helps to empower people and build equity in the very process of getting the problem solved. So community organizing goes hand in hand, and it's not simply a campaign strategy, but it's a necessary element of anything that we're going to get involved with. So we were able to get the inclusionary zoning ordinance passed. And we were also able to create a housing trust fund, working with community change, speaking to housing trust funds all over the country, able to get that created as an element of that inclusionary zoning ordinance. So that is a huge win. We're also able to get a community benefit.
Let me pause you right there. Can you just say a few more sentences? Like what is the housing trust fund, and why does it matter for people to understand what it is and how it might operate in Detroit?
So the Housing Trust Fund is a concept that dedicates revenue to affordable housing. The pushback against the creation of affordable housing is always that it's too heavy of a lift and there's not enough funding. And so a housing trust fund provides funding, a dedicated pot of money, a dedicated stream of funding that will only go towards affordable housing. And it's so important in Detroit because all of the housing being built, and this is a common feature in housing development throughout the country, is that everything being built is luxury. It's not only out of reach for the families that need it most, it is a fantasy for most working people, let alone the most vulnerable people. And when we're talking about COVID-19 and 41 million unemployed, that the dream of occupying those spaces with the price points that they've been created at will be forever unrealistic. And so the Housing Trust Fund addresses the fact that the market does not meet the need, has not met the need, and is structured in such a way that it will never meet the need. And so it creates a separate stream and a separate strategy to create housing that meets the needs of people. As you said earlier, prioritizing people over property and property value. And creates housing that is not intended as an investment, is not intended as a wealth builder for outside entities and hedge funds, and instead is created as a wealth builder for the families that live in those houses to build their own generational wealth, to have stability, to have health. And we created it because it is working around the country. There are hundreds of housing trust funds all over the country. It's not a new concept, it's decades old, and it works. And I think that's important to call out because so often we think we need another think tank, we need another paper, we need more research. And we have tools that work. We have had tools that work for decades. The Housing Trust in particular is very important because these are tools that were created by impacted residents. And so instead of focusing, which we often do, on creating new strategies, new methods, new experiments, and then bringing on impacted residents at the end to give their input, let's look to the tools that were created by the residents that face the housing crisis, the residents that have the lived experience, because that is where the true sustainable solutions are going to come from, because those individuals have the most to lose. And so they are only going to support what is actually going to work for their families and their communities, not now, but for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren as well, because that is how they're contemplating housing. It's not a 10-year investment, and I hope to, make great gains. It's something that I'm looking for my community to sustain, to grow, to thrive for decades in the future.
I so appreciate you reminding us that it's a core value that a lot of us hold, that those closest to injustice should be at the center of the problem solving and the solutions. And so I just really appreciate you pointing out impacted residents as the drivers around one of several tools, right, in terms of housing justice, housing trust funds, but really centering most impacted people. And on that note, I want to come back to you, Andreanecia, because this pressure to not just go back to the way things were is such an important part of this work. And you've been building a coalition of cities and states to really address housing justice and housing security. Can you talk to us about why it's been so critical to a community like New Orleans, where there is still $40 million in unspent relief from Hurricane Katrina? Tell us what your vision is of housing justice in New Orleans and around the country.
So part of you hit it dead on. We can't go back to the way things were pre-COVID because that wasn't working. It didn't work. And the proof of that is the massive unemployment, the fact that so many people are unstable, the fact that we're looking down, massive evictions, displacements, unintended consequences like instability of the insurance market, all of these things rippling out of.
Oh, I think we lost your sound a little bit there, Andreanecia.
How about now?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, I think this thing doesn't work.
I can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay, so I unplugged it, so I'm using my other one now. So I think as I was saying, that's the issue, right? We can't go back to the way things were, and we need to understand that and accept it. And Katrina is a lesson that we haven't learned. It's there as a marker. It's there as an example of what not to do. And yeah, the fact that we have almost $40 million, we've tried this over the last 15 years, state and local officials have tried to spend this money. Congress has got it locked up and they still haven't been able to get it unlocked. This doesn't make any sense. And the people it should be helping, it's supposed to help homeowners who didn't get back, who weren't able to come back. Those homeowners who were able to get back are now in jeopardy. Some of them have lost their jobs, have gotten their hours cut. Why not use the funding for that? That kind of creativity is just not being put on display. And again, people are still ignoring this really basic issue. So we called the groups together, folks from Detroit and Washington and Oregon and Atlanta, Georgia and New Jersey. And we're hoping to get more states together because we have to speak with one voice. We have to say that when you're telling people to shelter at home, you damn sure need to make sure everybody has a home, period. This is not, we can't go back to the pre-COVID homelessness situation. And we knew that. Homeless advocates have been talking about housing first for decades. And we have still been kind of clinging to the shelter model. Well, now we have a pandemic that demands that everyone have their own home, not simply shelter, home. And it's been really interesting to hear people, instead of saying shelter in place, they have been saying shelter at home. But we have not, we have not had this, the epiphany as a society to make sure that people actually have housing, guaranteed, safe, sustainable housing. This is a way to restart our economies, centering around people, centering around the most vulnerable, new economies, entrepreneurial efforts to make sure that those folks are safe and stabilized, giving developers and investors the opportunity to have their investment work for them and their larger community in a long run, in a way, because these folks now, so many of our, capitalists are kind of freaking out because it's not working for them. They're seeing their money slip through their fingers. Their investments are not stabilized at a time when everyone needs housing. Why are so many homes not being utilized? Why is value deteriorating? And it's because it's not centered in the needs of community. It is this intangible thing, and we've got to make housing tangible. We've got to make community needs the priority. And we need help for that. It can no longer be just one community speaking out. If this was just happening in New Orleans, like Katrina, or in the Gulf, like Katrina did, it lets everyone kind of focus on one thing, but it also says, oh, it's just the South. It's just the deep South. They're so wacky down there. They're flying their Confederate flags. They're marginalizing their people. It's the same old, same old. Well, this is Katrina by a factor of 50 in every state in the union. This is happening. So where's that cogent, dispassionate assessment of our failures to help our people? It's not there. Everybody's just freaking out and not necessarily, but wringing their hands and saying, well, we just got to get back to the way things were. The way things weren't good enough, and we can't go back there. We can only move forward. That's all we can do. We can only move forward, and we must again prioritize the needs of community, the needs of people. And it's stunning here in New Orleans, and it's the same everywhere. The people we need are the people we have marginalized. In New Orleans, 38% of our essential workers are cost burdened to the tune of they're 50% cost burden, severely cost burden. So the people who go out and make sure that we can all have food, those of us who are privileged enough to sit at home behind computer screens and work, and we have to go out and get somebody to bring us food, those people still can't, their housing isn't secured. They're working every day, and we are not prioritizing their basic needs. It's obscene. It is obscene.
You said so much of that struck me that the moment we're in is like Katrina 50 because it's hit every state. But you also, Andreanecia, talked about moving forward and the tangible things we can do. So I want to turn to that topic next, because it's really amazing how this is an issue that has real actionable solutions in front of us. And I'm hearing from both of your answers that the power building happening on the individual level, bringing new people into the movement, on the larger movement level in terms of organizations and coalitions, holding leaders accountable through this larger pressure. Can you share steps that people can take right now to be a part of this political pressure for more than just a one-time relief effort for renters? And I'm going to start with you, Amina.
I definitely think that looking at some of our stronger legislation that's calling for funding and supporting it is really important. We need major funding, and there's a lot of effort right now. We need to cancel the rent, we need more moratoriums, but in the long term, we need money to build this housing, and it needs to be done in an equitable way that centers racial equity. I think that we look at all the legislation that has come out over the past 10 years in all reality, and some that is introduced as recently as 2019. And then we look at the bill that died in the House a few weeks ago. And we need pressure. We need more pressure on the federal government for funding, but I think we also need more pressure on the local government, whether it be state or, in our case, specifically in my case, in Detroit, our elected officials to actually take up arms and start to fight realistically for the funding and push for the prioritization of housing. I really just mirror what Andreanecia said to say there isn't a priority. People are saying, we're all in this together. People are saying we're going to get through this. But the way forward to actually get through this and to make sure we're all in this together, I think, is very clearly to focus on housing and to center affordable housing in all recovery efforts and in all funding going forward. And that has not been done. We have funding that has come into Detroit for CARES, and we still have a significant portion of it that seems to be going towards commercial revitalization rather than housing. And so, money is going to be available. And we look at our previous disasters like Katrina, and we look at the issues all over the country, and we know that we have to create a reality that doesn't allow this environment that we're living in right now to repeat itself when the next pandemic comes or the next natural disaster or crisis, whether it be economic or otherwise, occurs. We've had an eviction crisis in Detroit. We've had an affordable housing crisis in Detroit, and we haven't done anything about it. We haven't put the money forward. We haven't prioritized it and shown the political will. And that's still not happening. And that's what this group is about, is that we're watching what's happening with our decision makers, and we're still not seeing them put forward the effort, the energy, and the money to prioritize affordable housing in this crisis, especially for the Black and brown folks that are being the hardest hit by the health pandemic. And what may happen is that we get a bunch of money that goes into public health. That is very necessary. But if we don't address housing, then it's futile. We can get money that goes into education because we see that a lot of people that are trying to learn from home don't have the adequate technology. The schools don't have the correct resources. That is very necessary. But if the students don't have adequate housing, then it's futile. And we just see efforts to work a little on everything to the exclusion of housing. And we still maintain the belief that housing is a privilege, that adequate, safe housing is a privilege, and that it's not something that is an essential foundational necessity that everyone needs to be provided if they are to live any kind of high quality life. And if we think that our citizens deserve a high quality life, we have to support housing as a priority, and we have to support the funding. All housing efforts are still woefully underfunded. And then we have the tragic situation in New Orleans, and even in Detroit, where funding is available, but somehow it just doesn't get to the vulnerable population. We'll find other ways to spend it on housing. We'll give it as tax credits to developers. We'll use it to revitalize things that are just above the price point that our low-income families can afford. And so it really is a question of political will. And I think as far as getting involved, it's about pushing our decision makers to prioritize it and to seriously prioritize it beyond talking points. And that's with money.
Thank you, Amina. Andreanecia, the path forward.
Yes to everything that Amina just said. And I would also give some real specific things that we can do if you're in the New Orleans area, Louisiana area, and other things that you can do nationally. So if you're in another state, you can reach out to Community Change, and they'll connect you to Amina and I and the rest of the team who are working on this multi-state collaboration so that we can support and educate each other on how we can hold our local and state officials accountable, and then work with our national partners to continue that advocacy at all levels of government. That's really one good way to do that. Also locally here in New Orleans and in Louisiana, we launched a few years ago a campaign called Put Housing First. More an action verb. And so people can sign up for it, and we give folks information when it's time to fight, when it's time to call. We send out calls to action, because the accountability component cannot be overstated. The analogy we've been using that I've kind of glommed onto that I like is that we need all letters of the alphabet in order to address this crisis. And what our elected officials and policymakers often do when they get upset about something, when they hear about something, for example, again, Louisiana is the incarceration capital of the world. We've been working hard on bipartisan efforts to address that. The prison reform groups have been really engaged and active and have had some real demonstrable success, right? I mean, unanimous juries. Again, we were one of the two states that didn't require unanimous jury convictions for felonies. And they were able to repeal that. And so we've seen that happen. But at the same time, again, to Amina's point, we've totally missed the housing component. We have instituted a tremendous a suite of bills that will look at the incarceration of 15,000 souls and look at letting them go early. Not a nickel has been allocated to house any of those folks as they come back to community. Not one nickel. And for the last 3 years, we've been working with those partners, and they have been frustrated as they've seen the barriers around housing. They thought that it was connected to, as long as it was connected to the notion of prison reform, we could get advancements made, and we have not seen significant advancements. One of the biggest problems we have right now is, during this COVID crisis, it's sweeping through our prisons, and we are not setting things up to release these men and women so that they can come back to communities, be safe, and have assistance and get housing. And it's actually a barrier to any thoughts of releasing folks, because the answer is, where are you going to send them? We don't have anywhere for a lot of them to go. In January, we got reports that there were over 500 folks who could have been released, or 400 folks who could have been released, but weren't because they didn't have housing. That number increased to 700 post-COVID because they didn't have housing. So we have this disconnect, and we need to hold our elected officials accountable. And so when our elected officials learned of this, they were like, oh my God, that's horrible. We've been supporting, mass decarceration. So we need to get on this. And they come back and they say, oh, well, they told us that they're doing A. We need all 26 letters of the alphabet, not just the A. You came back and told us we knew they were doing A. A is not good enough. Where are the rest of the letters? Where are the rest of the tools? And this is where there's a huge breakdown in the accountability, because what we got to go back and say is, that's not good enough. It's so nice that you met with us. We really appreciate you taking our call, but you didn't do your job, ma'am or sir, because all you came back was the first letter of the alphabet, and we already had that. We need you to use your position to get the rest of the letters, to get the tools. And that's where accountability has to come in. We need community, and it's hard. This is an issue because we're always waiting for people to stand up, and we're always waiting people to rise up. The fact of the matter is that the folks that we're talking about are too busy living their lives and struggling to show up for every meeting, to show up for every protest. We can't let our elected officials get away with that. It should not take 200, 300 people filling rooms to affect change. That's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. Those of us who do this work, we need to not lower the bar, raise the bar, and say that that's unreasonable what you're looking for, that you want 200 people. You know what the problem is. We have to speak. And we have to speak succinctly, and we have to speak clearly. And we also have to get over ourselves. We can't just be excited about whether that elected official took my call and they came back and they said that they're doing their best. That's not good enough. As we're telling our leaders that they can't go back to pre-COVID, nor can we as advocates. What we were doing before COVID didn't work. It's hard to say, it's hard to hear, but guess what? The communities we're trying to serve are the ones living with it. That's even harder. And if we don't acknowledge our own failures, we can't hold.
Well, on that note, we are out of time, but wow. You both have said all the words and all the letters, and reminding us we need all 26 letters of the alphabet. I'm so struck by how Andreanecia in particular, it's been 15 years since Hurricane Katrina, and I think to both of you, I think of both Detroit and New Orleans as the miner's canary, who have been warning us of the threats around housing injustice, around broader injustices in our society and our country. So I'm so thankful and grateful to both of you. Andreanecia Morris, Executive Director of Housing New Orleans, Amina Kirk, Senior Legal and Policy Analyst at Detroit People's Platform. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom. Each of these conversations could be their own series. I want so much more time with you both, because that was so informative. To our viewers, our movement truly is interconnected as we seek equity, justice, freedom for all of us. And I hope in this day of, we're going through some collective mourning right now in terms of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, so many others, Ahmaud Arbery that we've lost in the recent weeks. So I want us to mourn, and then I want us to organize. And I hope this show helps you feel more energy and enthusiasm for the victories around justice that we demand. And I hope that we can provide just a little bit of fodder for our imagined future in this country of being free and everyone being safe and having accessible, healthy, and truly affordable homes. So thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks right here on Community Change Action, Facebook and YouTube. Thanks again to my guests. Be safe, fight for justice, mourn, and then organize.